We are delighted to be with you today to talk about topophilia, the importance of place. What I'd like to do is introduce myself and ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves. We'll give you a very brief rundown of what we're going to do this afternoon, and then we'll get right to it. So my name is Bob Colvord. I serve as the Dean of the College of Integrated Science and Engineering at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Let me ask Gina to go next.
Hi, my name is Gina Fernandez. I'm a designer with Air St. Gross here in the District of Columbia, and I'm an adjunct faculty at UTC.
And Chris?
Hi, Chris Moret, Director of Scheduling and Space Management at Rutgers University in New Brunswick.
And Henry?
Hi, my name is Henry Way. I am the Interim Director of the School of Integrated Sciences at James Madison University as well, where I also teach geography.
And geography will be central to our topic today. So the plan is that Henry is going to set the stage for us with a slightly longer set of remarks. Gina and Chris will follow up, and then I'm going to serve as the moderator. I've got some questions that we'll ask the group as a panel, and then we'll invite you all to share questions in the chat and see if we can make this as much of a conversation as we can within the Zoom environment. So with that, let me turn it over to Henry and ask him to set the stage and talk to us about topophilia. Henry?
Thanks, Bob. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen here. I hope you can see the slides here. I've just got some visuals here just to run through, just to have some interesting things to look at instead of my face as we talk through this. So I'm just putting this on here for that purpose. No particular important slides or anything like that. So what are we going to do here? What's the sort of main topic of our conversation here? We're going to be focusing here on the idea of topophilia and the idea of place here. So this is not an focus on abstract space. This is not also it's not an interpretation of individual or particular places. This is about thinking about place as an idea. So we're going to be looking at elevating the importance of place and how it is valuable and why places and sense of place are important. So in short, what we're going to be doing here is thinking about the emotional bonds that people have with their immediate surroundings and why that is important in what we all do. So first off, what do we mean by topophilia? Yifu Tuan is really considered to be the sort of the main progenitor of this idea. He describes it as an effective bond between people and place. So what this is getting at is sort of deep connections, as I said, that people have emotionally with specific places. It's seen as something necessary to the human condition. It's part of existing. It's part of being in the world. It's having meaningful connection to places. There's a richness in and of that meaning. So it's similar in some ways to another idea that I think we've talked about here at other times, and certainly other people have heard of, and that's biophilia, that we have a necessary connection to nature, that it nourishes us and improves our condition, and we're better when we're connected to a high quality natural environment. So it's a related idea to that. This is the idea that we need to feel connected to places, and that we should think carefully about the quality of those places to inform our well-being. So how do we generate this feeling of connection, this topophilia? Where does it come from, and what do we mean by places? This is where I dive a little bit more into the theory here, and it's more a set of questions and ideas, not too many answers here in some ways, and this is why this opportunity is great, because we can start to share about some of the practical applications of all this and some of the developments and refinements around these kinds of ideas. So the basic definition of place might be easily summarized as meaningful location. So again, this is not abstract space, but a bounded, unique location on the Earth's surface with a certain genius loci. It's historically rooted. Sometimes people talk about it as a point of pause rather than movement, and that would contrast with the idea of space, perhaps. So place is considered to be a pre-scientific fact of life. This is focusing in the work with topophilia on this idea of place as a field of care and valuing things like belonging. Now, Tuan describes the process of place development as individually created. This is about individual emotion, thought, perceptions, conceptions. And he succinctly puts it that spaces become places through experience. So space becomes place through experience. And so the overall question then is, what are the qualities of place that give it a strong or useful sense of place? How does place offer security and meaning in a similar way to space offering freedom? What are the things that need to be done and need to be facilitated for that to happen? Just a quick note on the value of some of this stuff and this focus on place. A number of studies have shown that place attachment leads to greater psychological and emotional well-being and better environmental behavior. So there's definitely a growing interest in this field, and plenty of recent scholarship has explored this. So here are some sort of more specific questions about how we can think about space working as places. What are the things that need to be done to really kind of elevate and emphasize this sort of focus on place in a real built environment, in a real architectural environment? And this is where I'm veering a little bit onto the architect's terrain, and I will pull back quickly, but I just want to give you a sense of some actual sort of questions that this will attend to. So when thinking about a space, you want to think about what experiences then it can facilitate. Who can transform it? Who can transform it through experience into a place? This is not just about looking nice and functioning well on a technical or infrastructural level, but it's how does it work to make people feel comfortable? How does it actually work? How well defined is the potential place? How does it allow a distinctive identity to develop? Studies have shown that the better geographically and cognitively defined the space is, the more meaning it may acquire and the better opportunity for attachment from that. So how can people imprint on it? Can different types of groups or combinations exist there or across a building? How does it connect to other places? Can people actually give it benign meaning? And how supporting emotional engagement with the space and allowing creativity, how can we do that through personalization, through facilitating the richness of experience in those places? And of course, architects, designers, planners think about all these things, but the focus on place kind of elevates these kinds of questions to the top. Let me take a step backwards or above or below, whichever way we're going here, and think a little bit more about theory. I've tried to sort of introduce some of the practical kind of things here, but let's think about theory. What's some of the theoretical conundrums and questions around this? Just going to throw out some here as some examples of some things to think about. How important is legibility in that Lynchian sort of sense of imageability and legibility around spaces for helping them become more effective places? How much do we need to think about homogeneity within spaces in the context of the heterogeneity of the larger entity? And that's kind of attending to some of these ideas about cities. Does that apply as well to the campus level? How important is his homogeneity? So related to that, there's kind of a sort of a dueling view of places going on out there. There's a traditional conservative view of place, for instance. There's a sort of this traditional idea of a bounded entity, the unique identity, the historical continuity, the sort of cozy place of rest and defense against the sort of dangerous and alien outside. This is a somewhat kind of exclusionary view of place, and it's sort of in opposition to a more open idea. Place as a kind of open crossroads, a meeting place rather than enclave of rest, a sort of a location with interactive potential that invites diversity and multiculturalism. So quite a different idea about place there, and which one do we lean more into? If you're interested in building community, perhaps you might prefer that more closed idea, that more inward-looking idea about place. If you're interested more in diversity and external engagement, of course, the more open idea makes sense. What do those two different things though look like in practice? That's a challenging idea to kind of work through. And then, of course, in a university context, this is complicated. Campuses, university departments, they're looking to create community around the majors, for instance, to try and create supportive environments for students to help them flourish in the programs. But universities and departments also want to be welcoming, inviting. They want to be externally engaged. So it's kind of a balance has to be kind of developed here between these two things. So universities are funny spaces in many ways. Generally, they are public spaces. They're engaged. They're mobile. They have short-term populations. Mobile populations, short-term populations. They're mixed, but they're also really long-term entities. They're very rooted, they have really strong identities. They sort of lean into that as well. So there's kind of a balance to be struck there, and that's kind of interesting when you think about placemaking. Related question is, who owns university spaces? If I think about making places, we're talking about how you can facilitate experience. Well, whose experience here matters? What are the things that are shaping that experience? Places come from history, they come from the users. Is it the institution that owns the spaces in terms of them becoming places, or is it the people, right? It's people that have the experiences that shape what they are, shape what they mean. And the students are going to have different ideas about that from faculty, different from administration. So there's a whole sort of set of different kind of ideas there around ownership of places, of university spaces as they become places. Or is it actually ideas that own spaces and turn them into places? Is it certain ideas around pedagogy, disciplinary emphases, norms, cultural norms, learning norms in spaces that allow them to become places? So is it the institution that owns spaces? Is it people that own spaces, or is it ideas that own spaces and help them all and help transform them into places? There's kind of different sort of ideas there wrapped up in that. Perhaps it connects to sort of the idea of concentric status of places. They operate at different scales, that smaller spaces are incorporated into larger ones. How are they connected to other places? What do those relationships mean? And this is a hat tip, of course, to Christopher Alexander and the pattern language. And the pattern language, as others noted, is really a theory of places in many different ways. So developing that a little bit, how are places mediated by the hybrid experience we have these days? How are spaces channeled through virtual or remote worlds? How does technology mediate the experiential factor, which of course, remember, is how spaces become places, is through experience. So how does technology shape that? How does technology mediate that process of spaces becoming places through experience, as we think about technology being so present in our lives today, and especially in the learning environment today? So in many ways, we're sort of updating Alexander here in the pattern language to think about those kinds of sort of affordances and influences of technology on making places as well. So I suppose that's also a reminder that the places exist in a system. They are physically, literally, and as well as figuratively and conceptually points in an ecosystem, of spaces. And the ecosystem idea for learning space, I think Chris will be developing here in a few moments, talking a little bit more about that. But I think that notion of these spaces existing as part of a larger system, a larger integrated whole, I think is very valuable. I think overall, the topophilic approach reminds us to also consider the deeply felt human need for place. That, in the words of Tuan, place is a center of meaning constructed by experience, and that can have significant social and learning implications. And I will leave it there, Bob, and turn it over, I think, to Chris. But Bob, do you want to?
Oh, thank you, Henry. I think you have given us quite a bit to think about and a number of questions that we'll explore. But I want to turn it to Chris, who can bring his facilities planning lens as well as a background in sociology. And I'm really intrigued to hear his reactions to this and his thoughts.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome. And I should say welcome specifically to where I am today, which is the Rutgers University Alexander Library, brand new digital learning commons. And I thought this would be a good place, in part in homage to the previous two LSC conversations, agoras and libraries, but also a nice spot for today. And maybe some other time I'll put a GoPro on and we'll have a Wednesday conversation where I just walk around the room and give you some vertigo and perhaps I know in the Faroe Islands, I believe during the pandemic, when tourism really wasn't happening, they have a cast of folks there who will wear a GoPro and walk around within limitations, how the person on the other end of the computer and the other end of the world is telling them to move. So that can be in the future. But I wanted to start today with sort of six points. And in my mind, they very much relate to what Henry said. We'll see if that is the case. And this is sort of from the facility manager's perspective, although I think all of us on this call are generalists, and as we should be, thinking holistically. So the first thing I would say is this is really an interesting time to have this conversation. We are coming back many of us from a fairly virtual 18 months. And we're looking at a future that will probably be more virtual than forever than we were in fall 2019. And I think that's important because what place provides needs to somehow be at least recognized, if not replicated, to virtual students. And to the extent that we could not think about what place provides, or there was some default or practices arose over the years, in part because place does force connections for many of us, we need to think about how this maps to the online. The second thing I would say is to mention the ecosystem for learning, as I've tried to call it over the years, and sort of been this little guy trying to push the idea. And the idea really, as Henry sort of alluded to, is that the student experience takes place across a constellation of spaces, technologies, programming, whether it's a course, a conversation, a research project, really an idea, networks, cultures, and that these are dynamically interconnected. And I think that universities could do better understanding the dynamic interconnections and then leveraging those dynamic interconnections in ways both sort of big but also mundane, like, are our study sessions near where our classroom is on a big campus? Or are they hard to find? And where do office hours take place physically? And I've got to remind myself of that, because I guess I'm not too shy, and I would hunt down a professor and hit his sort of labyrinthine basement office. But not everybody is that shameless or foolish. So I think we need to think about these interconnections again, both in conceptual, fancy, complicated ways, but in some fairly mundane ways as well. So I've done writing about the ecosystem. I've thought more about it. But the point is that the upshot of everything I just said is that, you know, place, the sense of place, is happening within this ecosystem, certainly digital ways of interacting. And I think, again, universities could do better to understand the digital life of the student. Not just, so I'll say that. And then the second thing is, and even within places, a given place is one of many on campus and near campus. So I have a few more things to say, but they all sort of flow out of that, I guess, sensibility of an ecosystem. The first thing I would say is that when we think about place and space, to do what they need to do, to leverage space, to have place provide the connection and other things that Henry talked about, I would argue this, that some places, some spaces, that all spaces and places ideally would have certain characteristics: universal design, accessibility, natural light when possible. So all spaces should have certain characteristics. And if they don't, then we space plan around them. My campus will never be fully accessible to a wheelchair. We just plan around that. Don't have office hours on the 3rd floor for various reasons, including that. So all spaces should have some characteristics. But if we want place to do certain things, Henry, if I can put it that way, provide connection, provide visibility about the operations of the university to students who are trying to understand what college is, not every space has to do all of that. Some spaces need to do that, with the specifics being why we all have jobs. The second thing I would say, sort of in that vein, and I almost spoiled this a few seconds ago, is that I think when we tend to think of the spaces, whether we're designing them, we're operating them, measuring them, we think of what spaces are offered. And same digitally, what apps do computers have, do students have, what LMS do we use? I think we need to work really hard to understand not what's available, it's what is being used. And that's I think, a fundamentally sort of different question, related but different, that we would do well to think explicitly about. The fifth thing flowing from these is scheduling. So if we're thinking about spaces, places, how do we both drive people to them to begin with, or in cases where there's already a lot of demand, how do we ensure access? Whether it's a classroom, a study space, a maker space, a beautiful outdoor natural setting where there's learning happening. How do we drive people there? Not just through scheduling, it could be through a course assignment, helping professors understand that they should, hey, if here are some assignments you could come up with, and that would get people outside or to the library. And I sort of think of this one example, which I think was viewed as corny. They had a scavenger hunt at Rutgers. Students go on a scavenger hunt and get a signature from this dean. I think they found that infantilizing, and maybe that was the wrong way to do it. But I certainly think that if you build it, they will come is not an operative word, and we need to think of how to actively push people, and not just in some first weekend of school scavenger hunt, but a little more sort of infused throughout that student experience. And then finally, I have no idea if I'm over time or not, is to talk about metrics. How do we measure the quality, quantity, et cetera, of space usage? I talk this digital learning commons, which is just so majestic to me and beautiful and brand new. It's trending on social media on campus, so that's a good early metric. Obviously, that's not going to be the end of it. But what are the metrics? And I was recently, talking to somebody about a consulting project, and they said, what about metrics for non-instructional space? And I said, whatever the metrics are you going to act on them? So are they good conceptually? Can they be measured, these concepts, and then can they be acted on? And I think that is, that's the last thing I would say. I hope that was not a non sequitur with what Henry said or with what Gina's about to say. And I just love this topic. I'm so glad we're talking about it. And I think there's so much room for real action that we all can do as individuals and perhaps even as campus communities and architecture and planning firms as well.
Chris, thanks. I think you also laid out a number of interesting avenues for us to explore. Next up is the architectural perspective. And Gina, I'm really intrigued to hear how you're processing what you've heard from both Henry and from Chris, and as you think about the kind of work that you do.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you, Chris and Henry. Let's see how I think about the work that I do on a daily basis. So from the architecture side, we think about designing those spaces and how do they become places, and how do we help the institution that we're working with to express themselves in a way that students want to come to. And I think I struggle with this personally as an architect because we're new to a university. We walk in, we gain as much information as we possibly can, and we provide as much support as we can to create a space. But at the end of the day, a university is owned by those who are there, right? And I think it comes back to what Henry was talking about, is that experience of space and the experience of campus, that you are the expert of your own campus and you know what you're bringing forth and sharing with others. Something that Henry said a few LSC discussions ago was, as we're talking about the pandemic and we're talking about returning to campus, we talked a bit about this unbuilding, which has stuck with me for months now, since he said it. And if we are unbuilding the campus and rebuilding and bringing back these good things, what comes back to campus? What is the thing that we want there? And when I put that in the context of student belonging and students returning to campus and designing new spaces on a campus, I think of what does a student really want? What is the space going to look like that inherently ties them in, that imprints on them and helps them feel like they're part of this community or part of this campus? A lot of architects right now are grappling with the conversation, as universities are, with why do we need space, right? We've all reasonably successfully functioned in a virtual setting for so many months. Why are we going back to campus? Why do we have this rush or this urge to be back on campus? And I think it's most prominent with students who say we've got to be there. We can't learn virtually. We have to be there in person. I was teaching on Monday night, and I had students in my section and other studios who were saying we don't want to do anything virtually. We want to be here. We want to be all together. And again, it brings that question of how are we thinking about design, and what are we thinking about placing into our design that helps foster that sense of place and that helps foster that sense of belonging. I would almost take a step further and consider Chris's comments on the ecosystem of the campus and how all these pieces are working together. For me, when I think of ecosystems, I think of a social infrastructure. If you haven't read Palaces for the People by Kleinenberg, you absolutely must. It's a fantastic book talking about urban spaces and our sense of belonging to them. And he uses this term of social infrastructure. And I think of that in the context of what Chris has talked about. We seem to think in a very specific way of, here's my classroom, here's the 4 walls where I teach in, and here's the residence hall. I'm building this place for a student to put their head down tonight. And when I think of social infrastructure on a campus, I think of all these different places that we're crafting and creating in order to foster that sense of place and in an effort to foster that sense of belonging for students. So, you know, where a student might sit and rest their head in the afternoon, or rest in the afternoon between classes to grab a cup of coffee, and they're sitting in a student union, or, you know, you need to study in the evening and you find that you know, study spot in the library that has just the right amount of noise, but it's not too noisy and it's not too hot and not too cold. And I think it's about creating those spaces as well. To me, it is really interesting as an architect to be in these conversations right now, because we can't go in with any assumptions, right? I think we are looking at a brand new opportunity to design. And it's not just, you know, the back when I was in school, this happened, and it's not the, hey, let's sit down and have a focus group with students to see what they want in a space, but we really have to open our minds up to, you know, why are we gathering together? What is bringing us to this campus? How are we fostering that sense of place and belonging to where we're going? Bob, I hope that answered your question and pulls us all to a succinct spot to start this conversation.
It does, Gina, and thank you. That perspective is really critical to the conversation. Let me add just a couple very brief thoughts from the perspective of campus administrator, and then launch into some questions. And then I will invite folks in the audience, if you do have questions for this panel, to put them in the chat, and we will add them to the conversation. I find myself torn very regularly between feeling pressure to make the spaces, not the places, but the spaces that we have as fungible and flexible as possible, so they can accommodate a variety of use, and I can use them, we can use them as much of the day as possible. We're at a time in Virginia, certainly, and I think higher ed across the US, where we're not going to be going on a huge building spree. We're going to be much more thinking about, well, what's the inventory that we have? How can we renovate and adjust that? And so part of me says, I really need to be as flexible as possible so that we can react in the very short term and adjust spaces. And on the other hand, I am developing a growing understanding of the need for some spaces to be customized in a way that won't allow them to be used as flexibly as that. And I'm hoping we're going to tie some discussion about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion into our conversation today, where what I'm reading and what folks are telling me are suggesting that you know, we need to be more personalized. And it's really, you know, in some sense fitting that we're having this conversation today. This is the first day of class at our institution, and literally thousands of students are developing their own senses of place as we speak. And Henry and I have been watching them do that today. And so I'm really intrigued. And so maybe I can start the questions there, and I would invite each of you, as you know, in turn, to share a little bit. But I'm kind of intrigued, and I read the paper that Henry had given us and that it's sent around. And I wonder, you know, from a learning space standpoint, what is the equivalent of home and neighborhood? Those are two concepts that we think about a lot in terms of placemaking. Home and neighborhood, what's our on-campus equivalent of that in a learning context? I understand that a dorm room is potentially a home, but who'd like to think out loud about that first?
To theoretically martyr myself on that one first. That's a great question, and by the way, I'd have to give you a nod on that tension between flexibility and that kind of administrative standpoint about this, the most efficient use of space versus the ownership question. I see it myself as well, you know, as a professor here. It's a tough balance, a tough nut to crack. I think that's a really interesting question about, you know, what are the equivalents, and apparently, you know, if you think about the importance of the equivalent of the, you know, the highest and most ideal form of place being home, what does that look like in a learning context? And then the sort of broader setting of neighborhood there, I think you've hit a really good question on the head here. One thing I would say is, what does home do? You know, a home is a place of refuge, it's a place of security and safety. It's a place where you can grow. If you think about, you know, home as a child, you know, this is the place where you're developing. You think of the place as an adult, it's the place of refuge and calm and almost retreat from the rest of the world in some ways. So in a university context, I'm sort of thinking about this idea about what does place mean on campus? What is a place on campus? And we think of sort of place being this pause, right? It's a place of kind of stability and bounded rootedness. But of course, universities are these places of transition, of movement, not only in a physical way, a lot of people moving and coming back and forth, which makes that notion of rootedness and refuge really difficult, but also in a broader conceptual way. They are the places in between childhood and adult and true adulthood, professional adulthood, right? They are the kind of these intermediate places where you grow. They're transitional places. There's almost, you need to kind of capture a kind of a transitional belonging here. So I think that's at the heart of this problem of finding what does home mean in a campus space, even generally, including the dorms, but, you know, in particular in a learning space, is that you're wanting to have refuge, you want to have protection and safety, but you're also moving through that. You're also conceptually and mentally moving through it as well in a way that's challenging. And so that's a challenging one. The neighborhood one, I think, is very much the departmental space. I would say, you know, it's the space of the major. It's the sort of your kind of immediate ecosystem you're interacting with, and that's where I was sort of dropping in that the Lynch ideas about the heterogeneity of the whole. You know, in his case, the city; in our case, the campus, mixed with the kind of this more focused ability to kind of connect and be with others at the neighborhood level. But the idea of home is a really challenging one from a university, just because of what it is, but also the practical nature of those spaces. Sorry if I've gone on a little bit, but that's just an immediate response. Sorry.
No, it was a great response, Henry, because it made me think of some really good ideas. I think that when you think of, I'm going to play off of you, when you think of the neighborhood, and I think from a very physical standpoint, you can say that this is the arts quad, or this is the engineering set of buildings on campus, or we can very distinctly say these are different quadrants around a university. But at the same time, I think that we're seeing this interdisciplinary expression of ideas. And so do we really need to say this is the arts quad? What makes art, and how is maybe computer science folding itself into that? Or I think of engineering and I start to look at, you know, the exteriors of buildings, and wow, here's something that plays into one another. So that I think that neighborhood concept can be very physically applied to a campus, but when you think of a student and how they're engaging, the question is, do they feel a neighborhood or not? Or this is my part of campus or not? But the home thing that you said, and you know, I had a very interesting argument with my thesis chair about the concept of boundaries in a university campus, especially universities that are housed within an urban setting. And what does it mean to transition from the urban into the campus? We had this sort of argument of the sacred and the profane, right? When you think of a church or a religious building, that you are outside in the profane, you're in this, you know, world that everything had happened, and you step into the religious space and wow, you have this calming experience. And I think, and I'd like everybody to take a minute and think about when you step onto a university campus, no matter what you're leaving behind, that moment that you step onto the campus, you almost hold your breath. There's a bit of a reverence. You know you're in a space that is something different from what you just stepped away from. And I think to me that fosters that sense of home and that idea, so that when you take it back to what Bob was asking about learning environments, it does beg the question, is a learning environment a specific place on a campus, or does that learning environment translate itself to many different places? Am I learning when I sit down with my classmates to discuss something in a residence hall? Am I learning when I go to the athletic facility and I'm working with teammates and developing a sense of collaboration and teamwork, and does that build into who I intrinsically become as an individual? I think that those conversations about home and about learning, and to Henry's point about, this transitional period, whether you're, 18 years old or 50 years old and coming to a campus, I think there's a really, beautiful place of us saying, we all have this home when we are privileged to participate in a institution of higher education.
I love your reference there, by the way, to boundaries being so important to these questions here. A question that comes to mind is neighborhoods. Do neighborhoods have borders? Do they have boundaries, right? They're kind of, they have these sort of liminal spaces, but it's always an ongoing problem about how you draw lines around these things, right? And so perhaps the neighborhood idea is a really interesting one to deploy in the university context when we're talking, as Gina is, about multidisciplinarity, about creative engagements. Maybe thinking of the kind of these more disciplinary spaces in neighborhood terms, instead of making sort of insular inward looking them, if we think about what actually neighborhoods are, they're connected, they're part of sort of layers of different meanings and different connections, and they have very blurred sort of boundaries. And maybe that's actually an idea we need to develop a little bit here. And I do also like, by the way, the idea of the sacred spaces of campus. If you think about originally universities being these theological institutions, right? And the idea of the monastery and the quad looking inwards, and now we're trying to sort of hybridize that idea a little bit. I think that's brilliant. Yeah, that's a good point.
Chris, do you want to weigh in on this question?
As I progress through life, which sounds better than as I get older, I'm trying to speak less. And that's made easy by the fact that Marie, who commented in the chat, must have some kind of special thing inside my brain, because I was thinking of the hierarchy of needs, and my sort of pithy response to what's home is to think back to college and say, I used to fall asleep on the couch in the library. Maybe where you'll fall asleep is sufficient, if not necessary, for it to be your home. The other thing I would briefly say is, in terms of the importance of neighborhood, is, stepping away from the college context for a second, I think of what my neighborhood was when I was 15, before I had a car in the suburbs. And all this is imbued with my white, cisgender, privilege, and being a person who's not necessarily tough, but I'm tall. So people wouldn't pick me as a target. So I could fall asleep in public. But so I admit that. But I think back to my neighborhood, right? So when I'm 15, I have a bicycle. That's my neighborhood. Then I got a car, and my neighborhood had less significance, or did it change? Philosophical question, versus my dad, who grew up in Brooklyn, who didn't know the people on the next block. There was just enough on his. So I think, to bring that into the university setting, how do we choose our neighborhoods? How, if as a child, if as an adult, you sort of have this slower lead in to thinking of your neighborhood. At university, it's much more compressed. You have 4 years. You may have and in each semester could be different. So I think when I think of the boundaries, I think that's a good conversation to have. I think the timeline of the formation or the conceptualization of neighborhoods is important, and the fluidity, right? I mean, to the extent distance matters, you could be from your bed to your workplace, so to speak, in a few steps, perhaps wearing the same clothing, depending on, so I think that boundary question is really useful.
Well, I want to follow up on that in just a second, but I would respond to Marie by saying, just in my experience teaching at JMU, almost all of our classrooms are very homey places. So let me follow up on this. I am intrigued in some of the work that I do with the idea of scale. And so I'm really interested for you all to think out loud and talk a little bit about, at what scale do we connect with place? Because I think there's some inherent assumptions as we have some of these conversations, and I would like us just to examine them a little bit as we sort of think about the idea of topophilia and that making spaces into places. At what scale do we do that? And again, with the focus on learning, which scales are most important potentially for learning?
I just want to give a small thought, and I'm sure Henry's going to follow up with something amazing and brilliant. But there was something that Chris just said that really struck a chord with me about, you know, the distance outward from as you grow up and you have these concentric rings going out of how far you can travel. And he made a comment about, you know, now I can, you know, hop out of bed and I'm online. And I was fortunate enough to visit my godson a few weeks ago, and that, you know, that slim margin we all experience where we could maybe get out but not quite get out. And this 3-year-old, and I'm sure many of you have seen the same thing, but this 3-year-old hops on his iPad and you know, he's instantaneously watching YouTube, and he knows where to push the buttons and how that changes. And I have no kids, so I'm watching him like, oh my gosh, I can't have imagined doing that when I was a small child. And I left me thinking, as Chris said, you know, what was my neighborhood or my circle or my scale at that age, and what is, you know, my godson's scale, and what is he able to access and think about? And so when your question, Bob, really struck me of, you know, what's scale and how does that relate to place? It does make me wonder, in, you know, these students who have spent, some of them, their first year of college online, how is that relationship of space? When they step back onto a campus, are they automatically there, and do they feel like that's their space? Or is it when they see their classmates, it doesn't matter where on campus they are, but that is that moment where, okay, now I'm relating to you, I'm here with you, and this is the scale of our relationship, and that's where we are. So I think the idea of scales is changing because of the experiences we've all just had as we go back to campus.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. You know, it's that question of how technology is mediating our spaces these days, and everything I'm talking about there is both, you know, is it taking us away from spaces? Is it connecting us in different ways? Is it unscaling the space to have a digital world? Is it just a sort of a different form of the unbuilding we were talking about before? How is it changing things? I think there's a lot of unanswered questions there. Just one of the observations I would make is that when we're talking about scale, we can talk about it in physical terms, about the sort of size of the room, or the building scale, or whatever we're talking about. But if we're talking about these places becoming meaningful through experience, and to riff on what Gina's sort of talking about here, you know, that experience is coming in a learning context on our university campuses right now through the encounters with each other, encounters with professors, with tutors, with other participants in the class. And whatever the scale or the size of the room, if it facilitates two people coming together at a minimum, if it facilitates two people coming together in a corner, in a quiet spot on the side of the room, in a hallway outside, in a kind of a marginal space at some place, that is creating a place there. That is some meaningful experience happening there. And so again, I want to stay in my lane and not become a sort of an amateur architect here and say, well, we need to build spaces which make sure you can, you know, have these different sort of scales of interaction, where you can have little sort of breakout areas where people can interact and this sort of stuff. I don't know what the design standpoint answer is there, but it's about this human interaction, and that can happen in any kind of scale, but you've got to get these sort of people together, I think.
If I can just, go ahead, Bob.
No, I'm just calling on you.
Sure. And I was going to jump in, and it's funny, but I was actually going to reference Shannon Dowling's SCUP research before, but I did that last time, and so people are going to think I'm her PR agent or something. But based on what y'all said, and what I was, you know, and focusing on the faculty office, you know, I'm going to just announce this here somehow, whether it's a LinkedIn post or something else. I'm going to, like, and this was also discussed at our previous conversation, like, launch something called the Approachability Project, right? How can faculty seem approachable to students? It's a space thing, it's a syllabus thing, it's a first day class thing, and more. And to me, maybe after we have this conversation is great, it's conceptual, it's specific, you know, but what are we going to remember in 5 weeks or 5 years? How can we convince others of things? And maybe approachability is one of the ways to sort of coalesce how we think, and to sort of create that space for not just the people who do the physical place, but other things to speak and sort of get going in the same direction.
I think it's
I want
really,
to
oh,
change.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Bob.
No, Gina, I want to change gears. So if you have another thought here, toss it in.
Oh, I was just going to say that approachability piece, I think, especially with university faculty, I think from the architecture side, we are definitely running into those conversations of what does a new academic building look like? And you have a lot of faculty who have taught for a long time who say, I want a small office with a door behind a receptionist, and that's where I will stay. And I think that students are looking for more, and they want to experience more, and they want to be able to engage with their faculty members. And to some extent, I think this virtual environment has actually opened up those barriers where it doesn't feel like, you know, you're tied behind something. And I think maybe Bob, this is leading into where you're going, but I think this fits really acutely into our conversations about belonging on a campus. And when we talk about JEDI on a campus, so we're JEDI being justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And how are we reconciling some of these topics of justice around making space for students who are first generation, who may not have had access to education, who may not even know where they're supposed to go, or that they're allowed to go and talk to a faculty member. And by addressing, I think, a lot of these issues, then you come back to, okay, then how does the physical space help foster that sense of belonging, that I feel like I can be here, and thus I feel like I can go talk to a professor. And I think the conversation around faculty is one of very many things that we could talk about on this level in terms of space.
Gina, and that takes it back to your question that you asked at the start, where you're talking about why gather, why be in place, and putting my faculty hat on for a moment here. One of the things we missed, of course, through the Zoom education and remote learning time, were those encounters, were the approached conversations, was that kind of marginal learning, that sort of on the side of the lecture theatres learning, the office hours experiences, all that kind of stuff, which completely gets to exactly what you're talking about here. And that's one of the things we need to lean into to be done properly. And sorry, Bob, I didn't mean to interject.
No worries. I want to move there in a second. You know, an interesting experience that we've experienced, an interesting experience we've had here this week is, quite frankly, and I think a number of the other administrators on the phone have had this same experience. For the last year and a half, I felt like I've been running the largest paper and book use storage, self-storage facility in Harrisonburg. And now all of a sudden we're transitioning back into those spaces becoming places again. For a year and a half, they weren't. They were, most of them, unopened. And so I think this transition is interesting. And I want to pick up on, to go back to the JEDI ideas. Henry talks about transitional belonging. And so I'm really intrigued as we think about trying to make our campus spaces more inclusive and understand that we are working with people with just a rainbow of identities. How we can help them turn places into spaces, understanding that those identities may well be in a sense of transition as well. You know, it's not just their belonging that's in transition. You know, particularly for our more traditionally aged students. Perhaps less so for, you know, our non-traditional students that are coming back in their 30s or 40s. But I'm curious how you all are sort of perceiving space if you think about transitional belonging combined with the differing identities and wanting to develop that sense. I think for all of us, the gold standard is inclusion. You know, we work through the other pieces so that we can have an inclusive environment where people feel a part, they feel valued, they feel seen and represented. So maybe we could talk about that for a few minutes, and then let me invite that. By the way, the dialogue in the chat has been wonderful and a little distracting, quite frankly. So please keep it up. But if there are some questions that you all would like to put in, please do that. So who'd like to talk first about this idea of transitional belonging and identities and welcoming spaces?
Great question, Bob.
I know. I packed a lot into that. So it's probably overpacked.
Transitional belonging. You know, in some cases, I think that there are students who, you know, who have not been within a system that has allowed them to be who they are. And it could be because of race, it could be because of ability, it could be because of a variety of neurodivergent attributes that they have. And I think that a university or a college offers that opportunity to let them express themselves and formally develop as an individual. I think that the nature of higher education in the US and the way that the place that these institutions came from, the people that they originally catered to, is still lingering within the system, and it's still lingering in the physical architecture. And so it brings forth a question of, as designers, as architects, those who are architects on the call, how are we really considering not just meeting, an ADA standard, or saying, here, we're putting up, some colorful flags up on a wall, but what are the characteristics of a space that offers somebody the ability to feel like they belong? And I think that word inclusion is a tricky word, Bob, because you can include everybody in a conversation. I can say, hey, everybody come to this table and you have a seat. But just because you have a seat does not necessarily mean that you feel like you can be part of the conversation. And I think that some of our what we think is traditional, and I'm weary of that word, but we look at as being, maybe historic learning spaces on a campus, feed into that nature of a singular identity, a lack of diversity of both physical and invisible, that we should be honoring and celebrating on a campus.
So Gina, you're really kind of talking about a little bit of identity hangover from the history of the particular institution. That's an interesting idea. Chris and Henry, what are your thoughts?
Chris, I'll let you. That's
Henry can clean up my mess. Yeah, wow. I would say this, and it comes from Gina's point about what inclusion and accessibility are. And we classify our classrooms as either ADA accessible or not. And I sort of satirically say, congratulations, you can get a wheelchair across the threshold of one door in the room, right? I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying what ADA accessibility is, but essentially you can get into the room, back row, enjoy the view from back there. And I don't mean to be flippant. I mean to, satire is the jester's way to, somebody's got to speak truth to the queen or king. So I said, well, can we do something better than that? Maybe a gold standard classroom. And in talking with my friends at the Office of Disability Services, there are just not just so many sort of accessibility, what I've called accessibility profiles now. I just hate the differential ability. It's so contrived. So many profiles and so many activities, and the matrix is quite large. And so to use physical accessibility, if you're in a wheelchair, if you're a wheelchair going to Tillett Hall and you're getting dropped off here, then this classroom is better. If you can climb 3 steps but can't walk more than 50 feet and getting dropped off there. So my point is just that I'm just sort of thinking what Gina said, it's so complicated. And to me, and this is coming out of access in what is seen as the disability world traditionally, but I think it's true for everybody, is what Office of Disability Services do is they try their best to get universal, but they know they will not achieve it. And it's a continual process of awareness, of accommodation. I hate to say that. No one wants to have to ask for an accommodation, but it's hard to totally get rid of that. And I guess the way to sort of the middle ground, and I'll stop here, is to realize that there may be multiple paths to the formation of identity and to inclusion, and based on gender, race, personality, autism spectrum. And so maybe some people want to raise their hands in class, some love the Zoom chat, some want to do it Twitter hashtag running down the back projected onto the screen, and maybe that's how we do this, and sort of embrace imperfection. I'll stop there. It's really a complicated question that is why we have this conversation.
Just a couple of quick observations, again, without being myself a designer or anything like that. And I nod to you guys for the more inspired thoughts here. The first thing I'd say is this notion of, just having things as just, ADA compliant or taking care of the infrastructure. Again, this comes back to the idea of what we mean by topophilia, which is trying to find in that humanistic way the richness, the comfort, the joy in life. So often we think about spaces in accounting terms. We've got to go beyond that if we want to be serious about these kinds of things. And so that's where we get into these ideas of richness. And that's what Topophilia talks about, and talking about some things that both Chris and Gina have just been saying. The second thing is, again, to get that tension about the danger of diving deeply into the idea of place done potentially in a problematic way, as Gina was sort of alluding to there with some of the historical context, is conformity, right? You get an inherent conservatism through that in a negative sense, and you don't have that opportunity for everyone to find their place, literally, because of the conformity that comes with that traditional idea of place. I think also there's a sort of tension between, in place, there's a sort of a slightly inherent tendency towards fixity. But places, of course, change, and they change in meaning on an individual level, on a collective level. There's a great opportunity for malleability there. Maybe this is one way to address some of the things that Bob was raising about that tension between flexibility and need for kind of coherence, that how do places themselves conceptually embody both fixity and change, and how can we leave one to the other? I think that's an interesting conceptual idea. Maybe one way out of that, one way around that, is to really emphasize ideas around self-design, around more cooperative design, and less of the sort of the top-down design of spaces that we typically see in more hierarchical kind of campuses there. Maybe that's a way of getting to this. I suppose I would sort of finish up by talking about the essence of, again, of humanistic geography of topophilia, which is a recognition that to be human is to exist in place. And that as individuals, we are social. Sociability is deeply important to us. To be fully human is to be existing with others necessarily in places. And so anything we do has to kind of generate and has to support that building of sociability amongst our students, both for peer support to ensure everyone is able to learn and learn together, to build understanding of others and encountering others, and understanding through that themselves, and that social, the way that we learn as individuals through our interactions with others. And that was one of the things, and the key things that was missing through Zoom land and remote land, is that ability for that really nuanced, socially calibrated kind of understanding of one another, and the development that comes from that. And that's, I think, why remote learning for the university level, at student level, is particularly challenging, because there's a lot of development, a lot of learning happening in these spaces. So sorry, that would be a few things I'd say to respond to that.
We've just got a couple of minutes left. Let's do a speed round, but I want to follow up on what Henry was just talking about, because I am intrigued by what we imagine topophilia means in digital spaces, because presumably we are trying to make place. As humans, it's what we do. So very briefly from each of you, just some thoughts, especially as we're kind of coming out of the great Zoom whirlpool. How does topophilia, what does topophilia mean to you in terms of the digital spaces we've been inhabiting?
That's a great question. I have no idea. Go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing. That's so complicated. Sorry, Jean.
No. I think it's super complicated. I think it begs the question: what does the word place really mean, right? That when I sit down with all of my students to chat, or I sit down with my colleagues for a team meeting, we've created a place altogether, right? That is a virtual place. And the same thing for, there's a lot of gamers out there, and they curate their own gaming space, and they would argue, this is my virtual space to be in. So I think in the digital sense, and I think of, coming together, we're coming together somewhere, we're filling that void, whether it is pixels that we're filling or physical place that we're filling. And I think that the question is, maybe, and I brought this up when we were preparing for this, but I think it's in the Tao Te Ching, there's a piece about, filling a bowl. And when you put something in the bowl becomes a bowl, right? When you take something out, is it really a bowl, or what is it really, right? And I think that that stands true to both the physical and the digital. When we're making place, when we come together, does that thus make it the place? And when we're absent from it, does it disappear? Digitally, that happens instantaneously. If you said I'm in a physical classroom and we walk out, is that room still a classroom or not?
Yeah, it's
Well-
recognizing that places are people, right? It's people that make it. And I think, what Zoom does and this remote learning is, in many ways, it unbounds all this. It takes the limits of it, and that can be beautiful and wonderful, and it opens up opportunities like this where we can connect in new ways. As Gina's saying, does it dissipate very, very quickly after that? You don't maintain some of those connections. So.
That strikes me, Chris, if you're okay, that maybe we'll cap it here. I think that's a wonderful way to end a discussion about the importance of place by focusing on the people. And so maybe, Jeannie, we'll leave it right there. Thank you all for participating today. Thanks to Gina and Chris and Henry for serving as a very thoughtful panel and putting some really interesting questions out there. I very much enjoyed this, spending the time with you all. Thank you all, and we'll look forward to the next offerings from the LSC.